Picture this. You're tucking your child into bed, opening a colourful storybook filled with magical creatures and happy endings. You begin reading about a strange little man who can spin straw into gold, and your child drifts off to sleep thinking about magic and wonder. But what if I told you that the bedtime story you just read was originally a medieval survival guide about human trafficking, forced labour, and the exploitation of desperate families? Rumpelstiltskin isn't a fairy tale about magic. It's a sanitized version of one of Europe's most documented forms of systematic abuse. The Brothers Grimm didn't collect a whimsical story about a helpful dwarf. They recorded the collective memory of communities that had watched their daughters disappear into forced marriages, labour contracts, and situations so desperate that losing a child felt like the only option for survival. Behind the spinning wheel and the golden thread lies a documented pattern of predators who targeted young women in crisis, offering solutions that came with prices no family should ever have to pay. The strange little man who demands a firstborn child wasn't a mythical creature. He was a recognizable figure in medieval society, someone communities knew to fear but felt powerless to stop. You're about to discover that Rumpelstiltskin is one of history's most accurate warnings about economic exploitation, human trafficking, and the vulnerable position of women in societies where desperation made the impossible seem reasonable. The fairy tale preserved the memory of real predators who operated in plain sight, using legitimate-sounding contracts to destroy families and enslave their victims. The Brothers Grimm weren't preserving folklore, they were documenting a crime pattern that had terrorized European communities for centuries. In 1348, as the Black Death swept across Europe, something else began spreading through desperate communities, promises of instant wealth through alchemical transformation. While families watched their livelihoods disappear and their children starve, mysterious figures appeared in towns, offering to turn base metals into gold, straw into silver, and poverty into prosperity. These weren't benevolent wizards. They were sophisticated con artists who understood exactly how to exploit desperation. Medieval court records from across Germany, France, and Eastern Europe document hundreds of cases involving alchemical contracts that followed the exact pattern we see in Rumpelstiltskin. A travelling stranger would arrive in a community during times of economic crisis, demonstrating apparent magical abilities to transform worthless materials into precious metals. Desperate families, facing starvation or financial ruin, would sign contracts that seemed too good to be true because they were. The historical Johannes Mercator, documented in 14th century German court records, operated exactly like Rumpelstiltskin. He would arrive in communities hit by famine or plague, set up elaborate demonstrations where he appeared to transform straw, wood, or iron into gold using chemical processes that seemed magical to medieval observers. What families didn't understand was that Mercator used sophisticated sleight-of-hand techniques combined with genuine chemical knowledge to create convincing illusions. The contracts Mercator offered followed a disturbing pattern. He would agree to transform large quantities of base materials into gold in exchange for what seemed like reasonable compensation, usually a percentage of the transformed gold, plus room and board during the transformation process. But hidden in the complex language of these contracts were clauses that would trap families in impossible situations. Here's how the scam worked. After signing the contract, Mercator would begin the transformation process, which he claimed would take several weeks or months. During this time, the family was required to provide him with food, shelter, and complete privacy to work his magic. As the process continued, he would claim that unexpected complications required additional materials, more time, or different forms of compensation. When families realized they were being swindled and tried to break the contracts, Mercator would invoke penalty clauses that demanded payment in the form of the most valuable thing they possessed, often their land, their livestock, or in the most horrific cases, their children. Medieval law generally supported written contracts over verbal protests, especially when the contracted party was educated and wealthy enough to navigate the legal system. The most chilling documented case involves the Zimmermann family of Bavaria in 1352. Johann Zimmermann, facing bankruptcy after crop failures, signed a contract with a travelling alchemist who promised to transform the family's remaining straw into enough gold to save their farm. When the alchemist disappeared after 3 months with most of the family's remaining possessions, Johann discovered that the contract contained a clause requiring him to surrender his teenage daughter Anna as compensation for breach of contract. Court records show that Anna was forced into what was essentially indentured servitude, working in the alchemist's network of operations across multiple regions. She was one of dozens of young women who disappeared into these alchemical enterprises, which were actually sophisticated human trafficking networks disguised as legitimate businesses. The spinning wheel element of the Rumpelstiltskin story directly correlates to medieval textile production, which was one of the few industries where women could earn independent income. During economic crises, families would often increase textile production as a survival strategy, with daughters working around the clock to spin thread and weave cloth for sale. Predators like Mercator specifically targeted these textile-producing families because they knew the women had valuable skills that could be exploited. The transformation of straw into gold wasn't just a metaphor for impossible magic. It represented the very real promise that worthless agricultural waste could be converted into valuable textiles through intensive labour. The catch was that the labour required was so intensive and the compensation so minimal that families would find themselves trapped in cycles of debt and obligation that could last for generations. Archaeological evidence supports these historical accounts. Excavations of medieval workshop sites across Europe have uncovered evidence of large-scale textile operations that appear to have used forced labour. These sites contain spinning wheels, looms, and living quarters that suggest workers were confined to the premises, along with documentation showing that workers were bound by contracts that made it nearly impossible for them to leave. The most iconic element of the Rumpelstiltskin story, the protagonist's desperate attempt to guess the magical creature's name, wasn't about supernatural power at all. It was about one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated forms of legal manipulation, identity fraud, and the deliberate obscuring of true names to avoid legal consequences. In medieval legal systems, knowing someone's full, true name was essential for bringing legal action against them. Court records could only be filed against individuals whose names, family lineage, and place of origin were officially documented. Predators who operated across multiple regions developed elaborate systems for hiding their identities, using false names, forged documentation, and regional variations of their actual names to stay ahead of legal prosecution. The historical case of Wilhelm von Krautheim, documented in 15th century Bavarian court records, demonstrates exactly how this name-based legal manipulation worked in practice. Von Krautheim operated under at least 7 different identities across German-speaking regions, each with slightly different names, backgrounds, and areas of expertise. In some regions he was Wilhelm the Goldsmith, in others Wilhelm von Heidelberg, and in still others simply Master Wilhelm. When families tried to bring legal action against von Krautheim for fraud or breach of contract, they would discover that the name they knew him by didn't exist in official records. Court clerks would search for Wilhelm von Krautheim and find no documentation of such a person. Meanwhile, the real Wilhelm had moved to a different region and was operating under a completely different identity, making it nearly impossible for victims to track him down or seek legal recourse. Medieval court records reveal that this identity manipulation was so common that some regions developed specific legal procedures for dealing with travelling merchants and craftsmen who refused to provide verifiable names. Backgrounds. The town of Rothenburg ob der Tauber, for example, required all travelling merchants to provide sworn testimony from at least 3 established residents of their claimed hometown before they could conduct business or sign contracts. The Rumpelstiltskin story's focus on the power of names reflected the very real power that naming had in medieval legal systems. If you could discover a predator's true, legally recognized name, you could potentially bring them to justice. If you couldn't, they remained essentially immune from legal consequences, no matter what crimes they had committed. But the story also reveals how predators used this system to their advantage. The strange little man in Rumpelstiltskin doesn't just refuse to give his name, he actively mocks the miller's daughter for trying to guess it, confident that she'll never discover his true identity. This reflects the arrogance of real medieval con artists who knew that their victims were essentially powerless against them as long as they maintained their false identities. Court documents from across medieval Europe contain dozens of cases where families described being victimized by individuals who fit the exact description of the Rumpelstiltskin character. Small, oddly dressed men who appeared during times of crisis, offered magical solutions to impossible problems, and disappeared when their victims tried to hold them accountable. The physical description was so consistent that some legal scholars believe it may have referred to a specific criminal organization that trained its members to present themselves in particular ways. The most disturbing aspect of these historical cases is how the name game was used to separate families permanently. Predators would take children or young women under contracts signed with false names, then transport them to different regions where they would be given new identities and forced into labor or marriage. Even if the original families could track down their missing relatives, they had no legal recourse because the contracts had been signed with individuals who didn't officially exist. The story of Maria Steinbach, documented in 1,456 court records from Würzburg, illustrates this horrific pattern. Maria's father signed a contract with a man calling himself Master Heinrich the Goldworker, who promised to train Maria in goldsmithing in exchange for 3 years of apprenticeship. When Maria's family tried to visit her after 6 months, they discovered that Master Heinrich didn't exist in official records, and Maria had vanished completely. Years later, Maria's brother encountered her in a market in Nuremberg, where she was working under a different name and claimed not to recognize him. Investigation revealed that she had been sold into marriage to a merchant who believed he was purchasing a legitimate goldsmith apprentice. Maria had been so thoroughly isolated and psychologically manipulated that she genuinely feared returning to her original family, believing they had sold her intentionally. The name-guessing game in Rumpelstiltskin represented the desperate lengths families would go to in trying to hold predators accountable. The story suggests that discovering the true name would break the predator's power over his victims. And in medieval legal terms, this was exactly right. If families could discover and document a predator's true identity, they could potentially pursue legal action and recover their stolen relatives. The most chilling element of the Rumpelstiltskin story, the demand for the protagonist's firstborn child, wasn't a supernatural curse. It was a documented business model that operated across medieval Europe for centuries. Children, particularly young girls, were valuable commodities in a system that treated human beings as tradable assets, and predators, like the Rumpelstiltskin figure, had developed sophisticated methods for acquiring them legally. Medieval court records reveal extensive networks of what modern law enforcement would recognize as human trafficking operations, disguised as legitimate business practices. These networks specifically targeted families in crisis, offering immediate solutions to desperate problems in exchange for future claims on children who didn't yet exist. The contracts were written in legal language that made them appear reasonable while hiding their true purpose: the systematic harvesting of human beings for forced labor and marriage markets. The historical case of the Nuremberg child markets, documented in detail by 15th century chronicler Heinrich Deichler, reveals exactly how these operations functioned. Deichler describes a network of merchants who traveled through rural areas during famines, plagues, and economic disasters, offering families immediate financial relief in exchange for contracts that gave the merchants claim to future children. The contracts were masterfully written to appear beneficial to the families. They would offer immediate payment of debts, provision of food during crises, or solutions to legal problems that threatened family survival. In exchange, families would agree that their firstborn children would serve as apprentices or marriage partners within the merchant's network when they reached a certain age. The language made it sound like the children would receive valuable training and beneficial marriages. What families didn't understand was that these apprenticeships and marriages were actually sales transactions. Children claimed under these contracts would be transported to different regions and sold to wealthy buyers who wanted servants, forced laborers, or young spouses. The original families had no legal recourse because they had voluntarily entered into the contracts, and medieval law generally supported written agreements over verbal protests. Court records from the Augsburg Municipal Archives document the case of Elizabeth Weaver, whose family signed such a contract in 1447 during a severe famine. When Elizabeth turned 13, agents of the merchant network arrived to claim her as agreed. Her parents, who had assumed she would remain in their region and could visit regularly, discovered that Elizabeth was being transported to Venice to serve as a household servant for a wealthy Italian family. Elizabeth's father attempted to buy back the contract, but discovered that it had been sold multiple times and was now owned by individuals he could never afford to compensate. Elizabeth disappeared into the Venetian household system and was never seen by her family again. Her case was one of dozens documented by Augsburg authorities, who eventually banned these types of future child contracts, but only after hundreds of children had disappeared into the trafficking networks. The Rumpelstiltskin story's focus on the firstborn child reflects the specific value these children held in medieval trafficking markets. Firstborn children were considered most valuable because they were most likely to be healthy, intelligent, and psychologically resilient, qualities that made them ideal for forced labor or advantageous marriages. Predators specifically targeted contracts for firstborn children because they knew these individuals would command the highest prices when sold. Archaeological evidence from medieval household sites across Europe supports these historical accounts. Excavations have revealed living quarters that appear designed for confined servants, with barred windows, reinforced doors, and evidence of multiple occupants in spaces clearly designed for single individuals. These sites often contain personal belongings from children who appear to have come from distant regions, suggesting systematic transportation of young people far from their original homes. The Queen's desperate attempt to keep her child in the Rumpelstiltskin story reflects the very real legal battles families fought when they realized the true nature of the contracts they had signed. Medieval court records contain hundreds of cases where families attempted to void these agreements, claiming they had been deceived about the contract's true purpose. However, these legal challenges were rarely successful because the contracts had been written by educated legal experts who understood exactly how to make them enforceable. The most disturbing aspect of these trafficking networks was how they exploited the medieval legal system's treatment of children as property. Parents had nearly absolute legal authority over their children's futures, including the right to sign contracts that would determine their children's living situations, marriage partners, and working conditions. Predators used this legal framework to create seemingly legitimate business arrangements that were actually sophisticated systems for human trafficking. The case of the Swabian child merchants, documented in multiple court records from the 1480s, reveals the industrial scale of these operations. This network operated across at least 12 different regions, maintained detailed records of contracted children, and had developed standardized procedures for transporting and selling young people. When authorities finally shut down the network, they discovered documentation showing that over 800 children had been trafficked over a 20-year period. The final disturbing element of the Rumpelstiltskin story, the binding nature of the supernatural contract that seems impossible to escape, directly reflected the medieval legal system's treatment of agreements made under duress. In the world of the Brothers Grimm, contracts signed during desperate circumstances were considered legally binding, regardless of how unfair or predatory they proved to be. This legal framework enabled systematic exploitation that trapped families in cycles of debt and obligation that could last for generations. Medieval contract law operated under the principle of pacta sunt servanda. Agreements must be kept, with very few exceptions for coercion or misrepresentation. Court records across Europe reveal how predators used this legal principle to create contracts that appeared reasonable on the surface, but contained hidden clauses that would gradually transfer all of a family's assets and rights to the contract holder. The case of the Frankfurt debt spiral, documented in 1,462 court records, illustrates exactly how these legal traps function. Johann Kupferschmied, a travelling merchant, offered to pay the accumulated debts of the Brenner family in exchange for a contract that seemed to require only modest annual payments of grain and textile goods. However, the contract contained escalation clauses that increased the required payments if certain conditions weren't met, along with compound interest rates that made the debt grow faster than it could be paid. Within 3 years, the Brenner family owed more than 10 times their original debt, and the contract's penalty clauses had transferred ownership of their farm, their livestock, and their children's future labour to Kupferschmied. When they attempted to challenge the contract in court, they discovered that medieval law provided no protection against agreements that had been voluntarily signed, regardless of how predatory they proved to be. The most chilling aspect of these legal traps was how they were designed to be hereditary. Contracts would include clauses specifying that if the original signers died or became unable to fulfill their obligations, the debt would transfer to their children, their grandchildren, and potentially their entire bloodline. Families could find themselves legally bound to predators for generations, with no possibility of escape through legal means. Court records from the Bavarian State Archives document the case of the Zimmermann family debt, which was traced through 7 generations of legal bondage. The original contract, signed in 1401 during a famine, required the family to provide annual tribute to a merchant network. By 1520, the descendants of the original signers were still legally bound to provide labour and goods to the descendants of the original creditors, despite the fact that the original debt had been paid many times over through accumulated interest and penalties. The Rumpelstiltskin stories focus on the impossibility of breaking the contract reflects the very real, legal helplessness families experienced when dealing with these predatory agreements. The Queen's desperate attempt to guess the strange man's name represents the extreme lengths families would go to in trying to find some loophole or technicality that might void their contracts. Medieval legal experts developed increasingly sophisticated methods for creating unbreakable contracts. They would include clauses written in Latin, or complex legal language, that families couldn't understand, specification of penalties that far exceeded the original debt, and requirements for payment in forms that would be impossible for rural families to obtain. The contracts were designed to ensure that families would inevitably default, triggering penalty clauses that would transfer their assets to the creditors. The case of Master Benedict the Scribe, documented in 15th century Württemberg court records, reveals the industrial scale of this legal exploitation. Benedict operated a network of legal scribes who would travel to rural communities and offer to help families resolve debt problems by creating fair and reasonable payment contracts. These scribes were actually working for creditor networks and would deliberately write contracts that contained hidden traps designed to eventually transfer all of the family's assets to their employers. When authorities investigated Benedict's network, they discovered standardized contract templates that had been used across dozens of regions. These templates contained elaborate legal language designed to confuse rural families while ensuring that the contracts would be nearly impossible to challenge in court. The investigation revealed that Benedict's network had legally dispossessed over 300 families through these predatory contracts. The most disturbing discovery was that many of these contract networks had developed relationships with corrupt court officials who would ensure that legal challenges to the contracts would be dismissed or ignored. Families who attempted to seek justice would find that the legal system itself was working against them, with judges and clerks who had financial incentives to uphold even the most obviously predatory agreements. The Rumpelstiltskin story's resolution, where the strange man disappears in a fit of rage when his name is discovered, represents the fantasy that these predatory systems could be defeated through cleverness or luck. In reality, medieval families trapped in these legal systems had virtually no recourse and no hope of escape. The fairy tale transformation of legal helplessness into a happy ending reveals how desperately communities wanted to believe that these predators could be defeated, even when their own experience showed otherwise.